Hello and welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin. This is Jake, and we're about to read chapter 32 of Sense and Sensibility in a Southern accent. And you can check out the Cultured Bumpkin. So, what I do on this channel is I love classic literature and I read the classics usually in a Southern accent. So, the characters will be in Southern, sometimes the narration too, but definitely the characters a lot of the time. And then what I'll do is after I record, and obviously there's mistakes, there's sidebar comments, there's, you know, drinking sweet tea here. All that will be edited out. It'll be put on, edited into an audiobook style, and then put on the the web page for or the YouTube channel for free. If you want it an ad-free experience, you can join my Patreon, but it'll always be free here on YouTube. So, without further ado, let's do chapter 32. When the particulars of this conversation were repeated by Miss Dashwood to her sister, as they very soon were, the effect on her was not entirely such as the former had hoped to see. Not that Marianne appeared to distrust the truth of any part of it, for she listened to it with all the most steady and submissive attention, made neither objection nor remark, attempted no vindication of Willoughby, and seemed to show by her tears that she felt it to be impossible. But though this behavior assured Elinor that the conviction of this guilt was carried home to her mind, though she saw with satisfaction the effect of it, in her no longer avoiding Colonel Brandon when he called, in her speaking to him, even voluntarily speaking, with a kind of compassionate respect, and though she saw her spirits less violently irritated than before, she did not see her less wretched. Her mind did become settled, but it was settled in a gloomy dejection. She felt the loss of Willoughby's character yet more heavily than she had felt the loss of his heart. His seduction and desertion of Miss Williams, the misery of that poor girl, and the doubt of what his designs might once have been on herself, preyed altogether so much on her spirits that she could not bring herself to speak of what she felt even to Elinor, and brooding over her sorrows in silence gave more pain to her sister than could have been communicated by the most open and most frequent confession of them. To give the feelings or the language of Mrs. Dashwood on receiving and answering Elinor's letter would be only to give a repetition of what her daughters had already felt and said, of a disappointment hardly less painful than Marianne's, and an indignation even greater than Elinor's. Long letters from her, quickly succeeding each other, arrived to tell all that she suffered and thought, to express her anxious solicitude for Marianne, and entreat she would bear up with fortitude under this misfortune. Bad indeed must the nature of Marianne's affliction be, when her mother could talk of fortitude more to bad indeed must be Bad indeed must the nature of Marianne's affliction be, when her mother could talk of fortitude. Mortifying and humiliating must be the origin of these regrets, which she could know. Mortifying and humiliating must be the origin of those regrets, which she could wish, which she could wish her not to, which she could wish her not to indulge. Against the interest of her own individual comfort, Mrs. Dashwood had determined that it would be better for Marianne to be anywhere at that time than at Barton, where everything within her view would be bringing back the past in the strongest and most afflicting manner by constantly placing Willoughby before her, such as she had always seen him there. She recommended it to her daughters, therefore, by all means, not to shorten their visit to Mrs. Jennings, the length of which, though never exactly fixed, had been expected by all to comprise at least 5 or 6 weeks. A variety of occupations, of objects, and of company, which could not be procured at Barton, would be inevitable there, and might yet, she hoped, cheat Marianne at times into some interest beyond herself, and even into amusement, much as the ideas of both might now be spurned by her. From all danger of seeing Willoughby again, her mother considered her to be at least equally safe in town as in the country, since his acquaintance must now be dropped by all who called themselves her friends. Design could never bring them in each other's way. Negligence could never leave them exposed to a surprise, and chance had less in its favor in the crowd of London than even in the retirement of Barton, where it might force him before her while paying that visit at Allenham on his marriage, which Mrs. Dashwood, from foreseeing at first as a probable event, had brought herself to expect as a certain one. She had yet another for wishing her children to remain where they were. A letter from her son-in-law had told her that he and his wife were to be in town before the middle of February, and she judged it right that they should sometimes see their brother. Marianne had promised to be guided by her mother's opinion, and she submitted to it therefore without opposition, though it proved perfectly different from what she wished and expected, though she felt it to be entirely wrong, formed on mistaken grounds, and that by requiring her long continuance in London, it deprived her of the only possible alleviation of her wretchedness, the personal sympathy of her mother, and doomed her to such society and such scenes as might prevent her ever knowing a moment's rest. But it was a matter of great consolation to her that what brought evil to herself would bring good to her sister, and Eleanor, on the other hand, suspecting that it would not be in her power to avoid Edward entirely, comforted herself by thinking, and though her longer stay would therefore militate, okay, all right, and though their longer stay would therefore militate against her own happiness, it would be better for Marianne than an immediate return into Devonshire. Her carefulness in guarding her sister from ever hearing Willoughby's name mentioned was not thrown away. Marianne, though without knowing it herself, reaped all its advantage, for neither Mrs. Jennings nor Sir John, nor even Mrs. Palmer herself, ever spoke of him before her. Eleanor wished that the same forbearance could have extended towards herself, but that was impossible, and she was obliged to listen day after day to the indignation of them all. Quick little water break. Thank you for watching. If you're watching or catching the replay, thank you very much. Make sure. Okay, I want to try something. Look at this. Look at this. Nope. Oh, you there? Are you still there? That wasn't right. No. Okay. I'm trying to do. Sorry. Okay, hang in there. Here we go. Nope, that's not working. I'll have to figure it out. I will figure it out. Okay, there we go. So I am trying to put up a picture of my last audiobook, honestly, to see if I need to do a better job planning. Anyway, The Wind in the Willows, I've just finished it and posted it to YouTube in its entirety. So it's not like the individual readings like we're doing now with Sense and Sensibility. It's the finished audiobook, and it has gone up onto my, the main page under the full audiobooks version. And I don't know where the thing is. So forget it. Never mind. Back to it. But if you want to listen to The Wind in the Willows with Southern Mr. Toad, which is hilarious, you can try it there. But anyway, Sir John could not have thought it possible. A man of whom he had always had such reason to think well, such a good-natured fellow. He did not believe there was a bolder writer in England. It was an unaccountable business. He wished him at the devil with all his heart. He could not speak another word to him, meet him where he might for all the world. No, not if it were to be by the side of Barton Covert, and they were kept watching for 2 hours together. Such a scoundrel of a fellow. Such a deceitful dog. It was only the last time they met that he had offered him one of Folly's puppies, and this was the end of it. Mrs. Palmer, in her way, was equally angry. She was determined to drop his acquaintance immediately, and she was very thankful she had never been acquainted with him at all. She wished with all her heart Combe Magna was not so near Cleveland, but did not signify, for it was a great deal too far off to visit. She hated him so much that she was resolved never to mention his name again, and she should tell everybody she saw how good for nothing he was. The rest of Mrs. Palmer's sympathy was shown in procuring all the particulars in her power of the approaching marriage and communicating them to Eleanor. She could soon tell at what coachmakers the new carriage was building, by what painter Mr. Willoughby's portrait was drawn, and at what warehouse Miss Grey's clothes might be seen. The calm and polite unconcern of Lady Middleton on the occasion was a happy relief to Eleanor's spirits, oppressed as they often were by the clamorous kindness of the others. It was a great comfort to her to be sure of exciting no interest in one person at least among their circle of friends. A great comfort to know that there was one who would meet her without feeling any curiosity after particulars or any anxiety for her sister's health. Every qualification is raised at times by the circumstances of the moment to more than its real value, and she was sometimes worried down by officious condolence to rate good breeding as more indispensable to comfort than good nature. Lady Middleton expressed her sense of the affair about once every day or twice, and if the subject occurred very often, by saying, "It's very shocking indeed," and by the means of this continual though gentle vent was able not only to see the Miss Dashwoods from the first without the smallest emotion, but very soon to see him without recollecting a word of the matter, and having thus supported the dignity of her own sex and spoken her decided censure of what was wrong in the other, she thought herself at liberty to attend to the interest of her own assemblies, and therefore determined, though rather against the opinion of Sir John, that as Mrs. Willoughby would at once be a woman of elegance and fortune, to leave her card with her as soon as she married. Colonel Brandon's delicate, unobtrusive inquiries were never unwelcome to Miss Dashwood. He had abundantly earned the privilege of intimate discussion of her sister's disappointment by the friendly zeal with which he had endeavored to soften it, and they always conversed with confidence. His chief reward for the painful exertion of disclosing past sorrows and present humiliations was given in the pitying eye with which Marianne sometimes observed him, and the gentleness of her voice whenever, though it didn't happen often, she was obliged, or could oblige herself, to speak to him. These assured him that his exertion had produced an increase of goodwill towards himself, and these gave Eleanor hopes of it being farther augmented hereafter. But Mrs. Jennings, who knew nothing of all this, who knew only that the colonel continued as grave as ever, and she could neither prevail on him to make the offer himself, nor commission her to make it for him, began at the end of 2 days to think that, instead of midsummer, they would not be married till Michaelmas, and at the end of the week that it would not be a match at all. The good understanding between the colonel and Miss Dashwood seemed rather to declare that the honors of the mulberry tree, the canal, and the yew arbor would all be made over to her, and Mrs. Jennings had for some time ceased to think at all of Mrs. Ferrars. Early in February, within a fortnight from the receipt of Willoughby's letter, Eleanor had the painful office of informing her sister that he was married. She had taken care to have the intelligence conveyed to herself as soon as it was known that the ceremony was over, as she was desirous that Marianne should not receive the first notice of it from the public papers, which she saw her eagerly examining every morning. She received the news with resolute composure, made no observation on it, and at first shed no tears. But after a short time they would burst out, and for the rest of the day she was in a state hardly less pitiable than when she had first learnt to expect the event. The Willoughbys left town as soon as they were married, and Eleanor now hoped, as there could be no danger of her seeing either of them, to prevent prevail on her sister, who had never yet left the house since the blow first fell, to go out again by degrees, as she had done before. About this time, the two Miss Steeles, lately arrived at their cousin's house in Bartlett's Buildings, Holborn, presented themselves again before their more grand relations in Conduit and Berkeley Streets, and were welcomed by them all, with great cordiality. Eleanor only was sorry to see him. Their presence always gave her pain, and she always knew how to make a very gracious return to the over and she hardly knew how to make a very gracious return to the overpowering delight of Lucy in finding her still in town. "I should have been quite disappointed if I had not found you still here," she had said repeatedly, with strong emphasis on the word, "but I always thought I should. I was almost sure you would not leave London yet a while, though you told me, at Barton, that you should not stay above a month. But I thought at the time that you would most likely change your mind when it came to the point. It would have been such a great pity to have went away before your brother and sister came. And now to be sure you'll be in no hurry to be gone, I'm amazingly glad you did not keep to your word." Eleanor perfectly understood her, and was forced to use all her self-command to make it appear she did not. Well, my dear," said Mrs. Jennings, "and how did you travel?" "Not in the stage, I assure you," replied Miss Steele, with quick exultation. "We came post all the way, and had a very smart beau to attend us. Dr. Davies was coming to town, and so we thought we'd join him in a post-chaise, and he behaved very genteelly, and paid 10 or 12 shillings more than we did." "Oh, oh!" cried Mrs. Jennings. "Very pretty indeed. And the doctor's a single man, I warrant you?" "There now," said Miss Steele, affecting simpering. "Everybody laughs at me so about the doctor, and I can't think why. My cousins my cousins say they're sure I've made a conquest but for my part I declare I never think about him more than 1 hour's into another. Lord, here comes your beau, Nancy. My cousin said the other day that when she saw him crossing the street to the house, my cousin said the other day when she saw him crossing the street to the house, 'My beau indeed,' said I. 'I cannot think who you mean.' The doctor's no beau of mine." "Oh, well, that's very pretty taken, but it won't do. The doctor is the man, I see." "No, indeed," replied her cousin, with affected earnestness, "and I beg you'll contradict it if you ever hear it talked about." Mrs. Jennings directly gave her the gratifying assurance that she certainly would not, and Miss Steele was made completely happy. "I suppose you'll go and stay with your brother and sister, Miss Dashwood, when they come to town?" said Lucy, returning after a cessation of hostile hints to the charge. "No, I do not think we shall." "Oh, yes, I dare say you will." Eleanor would not humor her by any further opposition. "What a charming thing it is that Mrs. Dashwood can spare you both for so long a time together." "Long a time indeed," interposed Mrs. Jennings. "Why, their visit is just but begun." Lucy was silenced. "Well, I'm sorry we cannot see your sister, Miss Dashwood," said Miss Steele. "I'm sorry she's not well," for Marianne had left the room on their arrival. "Oh, you're very good. My sister will be equally sorry to miss the pleasure of seeing you, but she has been very much plagued lately with nervous headaches, which makes her unfit for company or conversation." "Oh, dear, that's such a great pity. But such old friends as Lucy and me. I thought she might see us, but I'm sure we would not speak a word." Eleanor, with great civility, declined the proposal. Her sister was perhaps laid down upon the bed or in her dressing gown, and therefore not able to come to him. "Oh, if that's all," cried Miss Steele, "we can just as well go and see her." Eleanor began to find this impertinence too much for her temper, and she was saved the trouble of checking it by Lucy's sharp reprimand, which now, as on many occasions, thought it did not give as much though it did not give as much sweetness to the manners of one sister, was of advantage in governing those of the other. That was chapter 32. Chapter 32. So we'll do one more. Chapter 33. Okay. Quick wet of the old whistle. If you are watching live or catching the replay, I hope you'll hit the old subscribe button and the like button too. I would appreciate that. Chapter 33. After some opposition, Mary Ann yielded to her sister's entreaties and consented to go out with her and Mrs. Jennings one morning for half an hour. She expressly conditioned, however, for paying no visits, and would do no more than accompany them to Gray's in Sackville Street, where Eleanor was carrying on a negotiation for the exchange of a few old-fashioned jewels of her mother. When they stopped at the door, Mrs. Jennings recollected that there was a lady at the other end of the street on whom she ought to call, and as she had no business at Gray's, it was resolved that while her young friends transacted theirs, she should pay her a visit and return to him. On ascending the stairs, the Miss Dashwoods found so many people before them in the room that there was not a person at liberty to tend to their orders, and they were obliged to wait. All that could be done was to sit down at the end of their counter, which seemed to promise the quickest succession. One gentleman only was standing there, and it's probable that Eleanor was not without hope of exciting his politeness to a quicker dispatch. But the correctness of his eye and the delicacy of his taste proved to be beyond his politeness. He was given orders for a toothpick case for himself, until its size, shape, and ornament were determined, all of which, after examining and debating for a quarter of an hour over every toothpick in the shop, were finally arranged by his own inventive fancy. He had no leisure to bestow any other attention on the two ladies than was comprised in 3 or 4 very broad stares, a kind of notice which served to imprint on Eleanor the remembrance of a person and face of strong, natural, sterling insignificance, though adorned in the first style of fashion. Mary Ann was spared from the troublesome feelings of contempt and resentment on this impertinent examination of their features, and on the puppyism of his manner in deciding on all the different horrors of the different toothpick cases presented to his inspection, by remaining unconscious of it all, for she was well able to collect her thoughts within herself, and be as ignorant of what was passing around her in Gray's shop as in her own bedroom. At last the affair was decided. The ivory, the gold, and the pearls all received their appointment, and the gentleman, having named the last day on which his existence would be continued without the possession of the toothpick case, drew on his gloves with leisurely care, and bestowing another glance on the Miss Dashwoods, but such a one as deemed rather to demand than express admiration, walked off with a happy air of real conceit and affected indifference. Eleanor lost no time in bringing her business forward, was on the point of concluding it when another gentleman presented himself at her side. She turned her eyes towards his face and found him with some surprise to be her brother. Their affection and pleasure in meeting was just enough to make a very creditable appearance in Mr. Gray's shop. John Dashwood was really far from being sorry to see his sisters again. It rather gave him satisfaction, and his inquiries after their mother were respectful and attentive. Eleanor found that he and Fanny must be in town 2 days. I wished very much to call upon you yesterday," said he, "but it was impossible, for we were obliged to take Harry to see his wild beasts at Exeter Exchange, and we spent the rest of the day with Mrs. Ferris. Harry was vastly pleased. This morning I had fully intended to call on you if I could possibly find a spare half hour, but one has always so much to do on first coming to town. I'm come here to bespeak Fanny and a seal. I'm come here to bespeak Fanny a seal. But tomorrow, I think I shall certainly be able to call in Berkeley Street and be introduced to your friend Mrs. Jennings. I understand she's a woman of very good fortune. And the Middletons, too, you must introduce them to me. As my mother-in-law's relations, I shall be happy to show them every respect. They're excellent neighbors to you in the country, I understand. Excellent indeed. Their attention to our comfort, their friendliness in every particular, is more than I can express. Well, I'm extremely glad to hear it, upon my word. Extremely glad indeed. But so it ought to be. They're people of large fortune. They're related to you, and every civility and accommodation that can serve to make your situation pleasant might be reasonably expected. And so you're most comfortably settled in your little cottage and won't for nothing. Edward brought us a most charming account of the place, the most complete thing of its kind, he said, that ever was, and you all seemed to enjoy it beyond anything. It was a great satisfaction to us to hear it, I assure you. Eleanor did not feel a little Eleanor did feel a little ashamed of her brother, and was not sorry to be spared the necessity of answering him by the arrival of Mrs. Jennings' servant, who came to tell her that his mistress waited for him at the door. Mr. Dashwood attended him downstairs and introduced to Mrs. Jennings at the door of her carriage. Was introduced to Mrs. Jennings at the door of her carriage, and repeating his hope of being able to call on her the next day, took leave. His visit was duly paid. He came with a pretense at an apology from their sister-in-law for not coming too, but she was so much engaged with her mother that she had no time for leisure for going anywhere. Mrs. Jennings, however, assured him directly that she should not stand upon ceremony, for they were all cousins, or something like it, and she would certainly wait on Mrs. John Dashwood very soon and bring her sisters to see her. His manners to him, though calm, were perfectly kind. To Mrs. Jennings, most attentively civil, and on Colonel Brandon's coming in soon after himself, he eyed him with a curiosity which seemed to say that he only wanted to know him to be rich, to be equally civil to him. That he only wanted to know him to be rich, to be equally civil to him. After staying with him for half an hour, he asked Eleanor to walk with him to Conduit Street and introduce him to Sir John and Lady Middleton. The weather was remarkably fine, and she readily consented. As soon as they were out of the house, his inquiries began. "Who's Colonel Brandon? Is he a man of fortune?" "Yes, he has very good property in Dorsetshire." "Well, I'm glad to hear it. He seems a most gentlemanlike man, and I think, Eleanor, I may congratulate you on the prospect of a very respectable establishment in life." "Me, brother? What do you mean?" "Well, he likes you. I observed him narrowly, and I'm convinced of it. What is the amount of his fortune?" "I believe 2,000 a year." 2,000 a year. And then working himself up to a pitch of enthusiastic generosity, he added, "Eleanor, I wish with all my heart it were twice as much for your sake." "Indeed, I believe you," replied Eleanor, "but I'm very sure that Colonel Brandon has not the smallest wish of marrying me." "Well, you're mistaken, Eleanor. You're very much mistaken. A very little trouble on your side secures him. Perhaps just at present he may be undecided. The smallest of your fortune may be the smallness of your fortune may make him hang back. His friends may all advise him against it, but some of those little attentions and encouragements which ladies can so easily give will fix him in spite of himself, and there can be no reason why you should not try for him. It's not to be supposed that any prior attachment on your side, in short, you know, as to an attachment of the kind, it's quite out of the question. The objections are insurmountable. You have too much sense not to see all that. Colonel Brandon must be the man, and no civility shall be wanting on my part to make him pleased with you and your family. It's a match that must give universal satisfaction. In short, it's a kind of thing that," lowering his voice to an important whisper, "will be exceedingly welcome to all parties. Recollecting himself, however, he added, "That is, I mean to say, your friends are all truly anxious to see you well settled. Fanny, particularly, for she has your interest very much at heart. I share you, and her mother, too. Mrs. Ferris, a very good-natured woman. I am sure it would give her great pleasure. She said as much the other day." Eleanor would not vouchsafe any answer. It would be it would be something remarkable now, he continued, something droll, if Fanny should have a brother and a sister settling at the same time. And yet it's not very likely. "Is Mr. Edward Ferris," said Eleanor with resolution, "going to be married?" "Well, it's not actually settled, but there is such a thing in agitation. He has a most excellent mother. Mrs. Ferris, with the utmost liberality, will come forward and settle on him 1,000 a year if the match takes place. The lady is the Honourable Miss Morton, only daughter of the late Lord Morton, with £30,000. A very desirable connection on both sides, and I have no doubt of its taking place in time. 1,000 a year is a great deal for a mother to give away, to make over forever. But Mrs. Ferris has a noble spirit. To give you another instance of her liberality, the other day, as soon as we came to town, aware that money would not be very plenty with us just now, she put bank notes in Fanny's hand to the amount of £200. And extremely acceptable it is, for we must live at great expense while we're here." He paused for her assent and compassion, and she forced herself to say, "Your expenses both in town and country most your expenses both in town and country must certainly be considerable, but your income is a large one." "Not so large, I dare say, as many people suppose. I do not mean to complain, however. It's undoubtedly a comfortable one, and I hope will in time be better. The enclosure of Norland Common, now carrying on, is a most serious drain. And then I have made a little purchase within this past year, East Kingham Farm. You must remember the place where old Gibson used to live. The land was so very desirable for me in every respect, so immediately adjoining my property, that I felt it my duty to buy it. I could not have answered it to my conscience to let it fall into any other hands. A man must pay for his convenience, and it has cost me a vast deal of money." "More than you think it really and intrinsically worth." "Why, I hope not. I might have sold it again the other day, but Why, I hope not. I might have sold it again the next day for more than I gave. But with regard to the purchase money, I might have been very unfortunate indeed, for the stocks were at the time so low that if I had not happened to have the necessary sum in bankers' hands, I must have sold out to a very great loss." Eleanor could only smile. Quick little break. 2 long chapters tonight. 2 long chapters. Let's see. Other great and inevitable expenses, too, we've had on first coming to Norland. Our respected father, as you well know, bequeathed all the Stanhill effects that remained at Norland, and very suitable they were, to your mother. Far be it from me to repine at his doing so. He had an undoubted right to dispose of his own property as he chose, but in consequence of it, we've been obliged to make large purchases of linen, china, etc., to supply the place of what was taken away. You may guess, after all these expenses, how very far we must be from being rich, and how acceptable Mrs. Ferris's kindness was. "Certainly," said Eleanor, and assisted by her liberality, I hope you may yet live to be in easy circumstances." "Another year or two may do much towards it," he gravely replied. "But, however, there's still a great deal to be done. There's not a stone laid of Fanny's greenhouse, and nothing but the plan of the flower garden marked out." "Where's the greenhouse to be?" "Upon the knoll behind the house. The old walnut trees are all come down to make room for it. It'll make a very fine object from many parts of the park, and the flower garden will slope down just before it and be exceedingly pretty. We've just cleared away all the old thorns that grew in patches over the brow." Eleanor kept her concern and her censure to herself, and was very thankful that Marianne was not present to share the provocation. Having now said enough to make his poverty clear and to do away the necessity of buying a pair of earrings for each of his sisters, in his next visit at Gray's, his thoughts took a cheerful in his next visit at Gray's, his thoughts took a cheerfuler turn, and he began to congratulate Eleanor on having such a friend as Mrs. Jennings. "She seems a most valuable woman indeed. Her house, her style of living, all bespeak an exceeding good income, and it's an acquaintance that has not only been of great use to you hitherto, but in the end may prove materially advantageous. Her inviting you to town is certainly a vast thing in your favor, and indeed it bespeaks altogether so great a regard for you that in all probability, when she dies, you will not be forgotten. She must have had a great deal to leave." "Nothing at all, I should rather suppose, for she has had only her jointure, which will descend to her children." "But it's not to be imagined that she lives up to her income. Few people of common prudence will do that, and whatever she saves she'll be able to dispose of." "And do you think it more likely that she'll leave it to her daughters than and do you not think it would be more likely that she will leave it to her daughters than to us?" "Her daughters have both exceedingly well married, and therefore I can't perceive the necessity of her remembering them farther. Whereas, in my opinion, by her taking such notice of you and treating you in this kind way, she's giving you a sort of claim on her future consideration, with a conscientious woman would, which a conscientious woman would not disregard. Nothing can be kinder than her behavior, and she can hardly do all this without being aware of the expectation it raises." "But she raises none in those most concerned. Indeed, brother, your anxiety for our welfare and prosperity carries you too far." "Why, to be sure," he said, seeming to recollect himself, "people have little, very little, in their power. But, my dear Eleanor, what is the matter with Marianne? She looks very unwell, has lost her color, and has grown quite thin. Is she ill?" "She's not been well. She's had a nervous complaint on her for several weeks." "Well, I'm sorry to hear that. At her time of life, anything of an illness destroys the bloom forever. Hers has been a very short one. She was a handsome girl last September as ever I saw, and is likely to attract a man. There was something in her beauteous style to please him particularly. I remember Fanny used to say that she would sooner marry and better than you did. Not but that she was exceedingly fond of you, but so it happened to strike her. She'll be mistaken, however. I question whether Marianne now will marry a man worth more than 500 or 600 a year at the utmost, and I'm very much deceived if you do not. And I'm very much deceived if you do not better. And I'm very much deceived if you do not do better. Dorsetshire. I know very little of Dorsetshire. But, my dear Eleanor, I shall be exceedingly glad to know more of it, and I think I can answer for having Fanny and myself along the earliest and best pleased of your visitors. And I think I can answer for your having Fanny and myself among the earliest and best pleased of you visitors." Eleanor tried very seriously to convince him that there was no likelihood of her marrying Colonel Brandon, but it was an expectation of too much pleasure to himself to be relinquished, and he was really resolved on seeking an intimacy with that gentleman and promoting the marriage by every possible attention. He had just compunction enough for having done nothing for his sisters himself to be exceedingly anxious that everybody else should do a great deal, and an offer from Colonel Brandon or a legacy from Mrs. Jennings was the easiest means of atoning for his own neglect. They were lucky enough to find Lady Middleton at home, and Sir John came in before their visit ended. Abundance of civilities passed on all sides. Sir John was ready to like anybody, and though Mr. Dashwood did not seem to know much about horses, he soon set him down as a very good-natured fellow, while Lady Middleton saw enough of fashion in his appearance to think his acquaintance worth having, and Mr. Dashwood went away delighted with both. "I shall have a charming account to carry to Fanny," said he as he walked back with his sister. "Lady Middleton is really a most elegant woman. Such a woman as I am sure Fanny will be glad to know. And Mrs. Jennings, too, an exceedingly well-behaved woman, though not so elegant as her daughter. Your sister need not have any scruple even of visiting her, which, to say the truth, has been a little the case, and very naturally, for we only knew that Mrs. Jennings was the widow of a man who had got all his money in a low way, and Fanny and Mrs. Ferris were both strongly prepossessed that neither she nor her daughters were such kind of woman as Fanny would like to associate with, but now I can carry her a most satisfactory account of both." That was chapter 33. Chapter 33. Thank you for listening, whether you're live or catching the replay. Please do subscribe. I'll see you back here tomorrow at 9. There's lots of audiobooks and short stories and poetry on The Cultured Bumpkin. And then I'm always looking for suggestions from you, the listener, the watcher, as to what your favorites are. I'm thinking of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, Moby Dick by Herman Melville, as to my next one when we're done with this. 33, was that 33? Chapter 33, 33 chapters down, about 17 to go. There's 50 altogether in this one. And yeah, so thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you back here tomorrow evening. So take care. See you later.